Uh, how come every single time I hit record, I just instantly freeze? I feel like everybody does that. So, anyway, I am excited today. I don't know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to start over and pausing. Welcome to episode 2. Yeah, episode 2 of the Unbusiness Podcast. My gosh, I've been waiting for this. I'm really excited. We actually get to dig in and start introducing our very cool topic, which is conflict resolution. I know you are as excited to talk about conflict as I am, but I promise you, it is cool and it's going to help you and it's important because there's conflict everywhere. And sometimes it's really hard to deal with, and other times you don't even realize that you're dealing with it and you're doing an awesome job. The beginning of all of this starts with this panel that I spoke on, and what it comes down to is all about relationships. The panel was really cool. It was through Northeastern University and Dreamers Doers, which is a very cool community that I'm a part of. And we were talking to Northeastern University's entrepreneurship program all about women-owned businesses. This is a topic that I absolutely adore and I could talk about all day. And so I was talking with two other amazing panelists, and in it, one of the panelists I knew, the other one I did not, and we just really clicked. We worked really well together. We formed this really great relationship. And what I realized was that, as I've spoken about probably 100,000 times in all of these panels, everything in business comes down to relationships and what ultimately happens when you have relationships, but you have conflict. So we have to learn to deal with it, because even in the best relationships, sometimes conflict is going to come up and avoiding it is not the answer. Also, sometimes running headlong into it isn't the answer either. So we're going to come up with a framework over the course of this season where we're going to talk about how to recognize it and how to deal with it and how to figure out your own conflict resolution style. So I'm recording this in the fall. It is just an incredibly beautiful day in the New York area today. Yesterday, we basically had a monsoon, but today it is gorgeous. You, however, are listening to this in the new year, and many of us, we come up with resolutions. So we are going to resolve in this new year to learn to deal with conflict. And I am assuming as you are hearing this, you are having some inner conflict, see what I did there, full circle, about dealing with conflict. So we're going to resolve that. We're going to sit down and we're going to make peace with it, and we're going to realize that we have to learn to deal with it, and we're going to do it in a really manageable way. So let's talk about what is conflict, right? How do we define what conflict is? In your mind, I'm guessing you're thinking of a really horrible fight maybe you had with a child or a sibling or your spouse or a partner or your friend or a vendor, someone that you've hired. Maybe it's the person who is doing construction on your house. Whatever the case may be, I'm guessing you're thinking of an incredibly emotional and kind of awful time where you were having to yell or get frustrated or emotions were running high. But that's not all conflict is. Conflict can sometimes be less obvious than that. And I want to give you an example because I've gotten a lot of feedback over the years that people like to hear the law firm stories. So I'm going to share a lot of those stories. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of conflict in my legal practice. So sometimes I get to negotiate on behalf of or with famous people. For the most part, it doesn't really affect me either way, although I will tell you there was someone, separate side note, that I recently got to represent, and I won't lie, I geeked out a little bit. But I digress. I was negotiating with the agent of a particularly famous person on behalf of a client of mine that was a brand that wanted a partnership with that client. And immediately we got on the phone because I'm a firm believer in conversations when dealing with conflict. And the first thing the agent said to me was, I hope you understand that I'm just going to have to be really aggressive with you and this isn't personal. And as I'm sure you can imagine, I was a little bit taken aback because I didn't assume that, nor did I think that was ever really necessary. But that right there is a perfect example of conflict, because right then and there, my emotions went up and I got a little bit defensive mentally, and I had to take a moment myself and say, all right, slow down. We don't even have any conflict yet, but let's just try to figure this out. So those little tiny statements that either you weren't expecting or frankly aren't necessary That's conflict. I can give you another really good example of a time when I was dealing with conflict. This is the kind of quintessential. I was in a really contentious negotiation where we were trying to negotiate a settlement for a dispute between my client and opposing counsel's client. And I was talking to this gentleman, which frankly is a term I'm going to use loosely here. I said something that was legally accurate, and frankly, he hadn't thought of, and it took him a little bit off guard, and made my position stronger. So instead of thinking that through and realize, oh, maybe I had a good point, he just started screaming at me. And so I politely and calmly said, please don't scream at me, to which he responded, I'm not screaming. If I was screaming, you'd know, which then made me pause and question everything I ever knew, because I was pretty sure he was screaming, to which I responded to him and said, well, you are screaming, and I've just told you that you are, and he told me to turn down the volume on my phone. I swear this actually happened. And so that's real conflict. And I had a moment where I just said to him, hey, if you can't stop screaming, I'm not having this conversation with you. But the fact is, we were contentious and had conflict the entire time. This one escalated. And then the last example of conflict came during the pandemic. I mean, how many of us had experiences of conflict during the pandemic? But this one was a lot more subtle. I was having dinner with a friend. This was after restaurants had reopened and we were permitted to eat inside. And the restaurant had sat us inside. And I could tell my friend was incredibly uncomfortable about sitting inside, but didn't want to say anything. And so I looked at my friend and I said, hey, do you want to sit outside? And the friend replied, no, it's fine. And I had to look at that friend and say, hey, if you want to sit outside, I'd like us to sit outside because I really don't want to sit here feeling uncomfortable and not saying anything. And so that was conflict because I had to sort of call it a friend who I think was just trying to be nice. And there wasn't any animosity or anger. I wanted my friend to be comfortable. My friend wanted me to be comfortable. But again, conflict. So I've given you a whole bunch of examples now. And so now I want you, this is your homework, and I want you to think about what is conflict to you? When have you experienced conflict? And what does it mean? How did you feel when you experienced conflict? What did you need to do? Did you run away from it? Did you run right into it? I mean, there are both. Some of you may hate it. Some of you may run from it as far as you possibly can. And others, they love it. People thrive on conflict. They get very excited about dealing with conflict. And there are some people who actively pursue conflict. I think that gentleman that I spoke about on the phone, he's a really good example of someone who actively pursues conflict. Now, I'm not going to get into the psychology of why somebody, because I'm not a psychologist. However, I do deal with conflict quite a bit. There are just some people out there, they like to argue. And so none of that is right or wrong. But I need you, while we're going through this process, and this is what you need to do from this first episode about conflict, is to think about times in your life when you experienced conflict. How did you feel about it? What were your reactions? What did you do? Has it changed over time how you deal with conflict? Because I'll tell you that how I dealt with conflict in my 20s is very different than I deal with conflict in my 40s. I have conflict with my kids all the time. How I manage that conflict may be very different than the conflict that I manage with adverse counsel. And so there's lots of different scenarios. I'm focusing on business relationships. So we can take some of the emotion out of the conflict because in business relationships, we're not dealing with those interpersonal skills that we're dealing with our family or our very, very close friends. So this is really focused on how we're dealing with conflict as an entrepreneur. Because, as I've said quite a few times, you cannot avoid it. It will come up, and at a certain point, you will have to deal with it. As someone who for a very long time actively avoided conflict, I can promise you it ultimately comes back. It does just not go away. I have another example from my practice that actually happened directly to me. I had a client who I could tell from the minute that we started, we probably were not going to be the right fit. This client was really laser focused on details that frankly didn't matter. And she was incredibly focused on what I thought were really not the right things she needed to be worried about. And so every single time I would do a project for her, it would come back to me detailing if I missed a period somewhere or if there was an accidental typo, because let's face it, I'm human. Typos occasionally happen. We try not to make them happen, but they occasionally do. And she was so laser focused, all she wanted to do was fight about that. And at the end of the day, what I realized in this relationship was she really couldn't handle the bigger picture and the bigger issues that we needed to deal with in her business. And so it was much, much easier to focus on something smaller. But I could tell she enjoyed the fight. She enjoyed the argument. And I know that that doesn't work for me. So I realized that that was just not a relationship that I could have, and we ended that relationship, thankfully with not a lot of conflict, but with the realization that maybe we weren't the right fit for each other. So we're going to deal with a lot about conflict. I think I've said the word like 150 times at this point. And so right now, from this episode, based on my stories, I want you to reflect on your business relationships. I want you to come up with some of the instances where you had conflict, how you dealt with that conflict. And I also want you to think about when there were instances where you maybe could have avoided conflict when you shouldn't have, and what the effect was, and whether or not that conflict ultimately came back in a different way. And so in doing so, it's going to enable you to consider your relationship with conflict, how you handle conflict, and what your instant reactions, because in order to more easily handle conflict, you first have to resolve internally, well, what is my relationship to conflict? And then you're going to be able to use the tips and tricks that are coming and benefit from the stories that I'm going to tell, because believe me, I have a lot of stories that are coming. And you're going to be able to apply those tips and tricks directly to your business, because when conflict comes around, you're then going to be much better equipped to handle it. So I would love to hear from you all about your relationship with conflict, how you feel about it, if it scares you, if you like it, if you're kind of neutral on it, because some people, they don't care. And that I think will be really helpful for the people listening to normalize your feelings about conflict, because there's no wrong answer. However, we can always get better about how we deal with it and what we do when we're faced with conflict. Now that you've had the chance to think about your relationship with conflict, and if you haven't done it yet, that's okay, you have a week, because next week we're going to be talking about those first set of tips and tricks on how to deal with conflict when it comes your way, and what you need to do when faced with a conflict. And to do that, I need you to think about what your relationship to conflict actually is. So you can check us out on anywhere that you listen to podcasts. We also have a video of this podcast on my YouTube channel. You can find me at youtube.com/Jamie Lieberman Rocks is the name of our YouTube channel, and anywhere that you listen to podcasts. You can also find show notes and lots of good links and resources at the #legal.com website. And if you're so inclined, we would love some reviews, because we need reviews in order to get this podcast up and running. If this was helpful to you, if you liked it, please go ahead and give us a review. We would greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.